Well, we have been trying to learn something about the character of God, the kind of God that He is, from the story of Genesis. Along the way, we're trying to hang on to some key ideas. God has revealed, woven into creation, this idea: morning follows night. In other words, no matter how dark your world is, light will come. God has promised it. A new day will dawn. Second, God is incredibly personal. He is present in your life, in your world, and even your sin cannot prevent Him from moving to be known, seen, and felt. You can't stop God from wanting to be present in your life. It isn't possible. Adam and Eve walked with God in the garden, and Cain, even in the midst of his sin, in the darkness of plotting his brother's death, spoke to God, because God is personal. He is present. Your sin is not big enough. I want to make sure I slow down. Your sin is not big enough to prevent a powerful God from transforming darkness into light. It is not possible. We also know from Cain and from the story of the Tower of Babel that while we often see God's discipline as punishment, the truth is that God hides blessings in the discipline that He extends to His children. Because, are you learning it yet? Morning follows night. And God's promises are based not upon our righteousness. It's a truth we know, but I think we have to remind ourselves of this. God's promises, His ability to transform darkness into light, is not based upon our righteousness, but it is based on His faithfulness, His goodness. Abraham is our proof. Sarah is our proof. God promised her a child, even in her old age, and she laughed. Ridiculous. It's a good thing that God is loving, forgiving, and patient. What was God's discipline for Sarah's lack of faith? He hid the blessing inside the child. His name is laughter. Because each time, can you imagine it? Laughter, dinner is ready. The discipline that God extended to Sarah every time she called her son. It's that God is faithful. And Sarah remembers that she is the one blessed, not cursed for her lack of faith. It's a remarkable thing. And today we're going to look at another encounter in Genesis 22. But before we read it, I want to set the stage. And I want us to make sure that we have a key element in the story as we begin, so that we can really have an insight into the character of God. And from the book of Hosea, which is a love story, it's just a terrible love story. But it's a love story about the prophet Hosea called to reveal the character of God, to reveal God's heart and His love for His people, an adulterous people who reject His love. And for Hosea, that meant in a very real sense that he was revealing that by being married to a prostitute. And Hosea honored his vows while his wife did not. And in the text we read, "Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but He will heal us. He has injured us, but He will bind up our wounds. After 2 days, He will revive us. On the third day, He will restore us, that we may live in His presence. Let us acknowledge the Lord. Let us press on to acknowledge him. As surely as the sun rises, he will appear. He will come to us like the winter rains, like the spring rains that water the earth. This is an eternal promise of God that he will seek us. He will come to us. He will heal us, bind up our wounds. After 2 days, on the third day, did you see it? He will restore us. That is the character of God. He will save. He will. Because, did you see it in the text too? Morning follows night. The morning will dawn. So Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son to kill laughter. I have to say it that way because if, as I've always understood this story, Abraham is a stand-in for God, revealing a bigger picture, the story of his encounter with humanity, then laughter had already died. You see, Adam and Eve had already sinned. Death had already entered the world. And for generations, God's beloved creatures, his children, had died. They had aged, died, and been buried, returned to dust. Laughter had already died. The joy we were meant to experience had turned to sorrow as sin ravaged our hearts and destroyed our world. That's the story of Genesis. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, what does God do on the third day? Heal us. Whatever you think of this story before you've begun, did you notice? I know that you, if you've grown up in church, already know this story. In fact, this story is significant for 2 of the world's largest religious beliefs, even for a third. But did you notice the story? What does God do on the third day? What is his intention, regardless of Abraham's faith? See, I think sometimes we miss the point. Is God's ability to bless Abraham based upon Abraham's actions? No. It is not. It's the third day. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." From the beginning, God has been determined to rescue us. This test, Abraham's willingness to kill his son, makes much more sense to my father heart. Are there any fathers in the room? John, you with me? A father's heart as you hold your sleeping baby. This story makes much more sense from this perspective. God never intended to allow one, not one of his children to die. Ever. Ever. If you don't believe me, reread your New Testament. He has never intended for any of his children to perish. It is God's desire that no one should perish. But our actions, our sin, produces death. We create it. We produce death. Because each of us, and this is a key understanding, it's hard to grasp, but each one of us is already dead. See, the world can't understand that. But again, the New Testament creates this understanding so clearly while we're trying to hang on to the illusion of life. Real life exists. This is not it. Death is what we already know. We are already bound, already laid on the altar, sacrificed to a dominion of darkness. That's reality. But our loving Father refuses to accept that. But it is our own rebellious and adulterous hearts that have produced this reality. And what is God's response to the condition of his people? And if you know the story, I don't need to read it to you. They get to the mountain. Abraham binds his son, places him on the altar, and he takes the knife, and he's about to strike. And what is God's response to the condition of his people? A stay of execution. Stop. God speaks, and Abraham's death blow. Our own actions that will ultimately produce our own destruction. Our actions. God halts them. Stop. Why? Because the Lamb has already been given. Since the beginning of creation, the Lamb, it's already been ordained. Generations that don't even exist yet, the Lamb has already been offered for their sin. And how do I know? I love it when people ask me how I know things. How do I know this is so? It's at the heart of the good news. It in fact is the good news. For he, God, has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption for the forgiveness of sins. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things were created by him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. Can you see the story? The character of God revealed in the pages of the text? You see, God is not the one bound. You are. You are bound by your choices. But he is not. An all-powerful God, driven to create you in love, knowing it would require his blood, his death to save you. And a new way has been opened. The firstborn son from among the dead. We were already dead. So you see, the author of life entered the world, a dead world, so that death would be defeated. The world around you is a world full of death, not life. It's why it's so hard when the beginning point isn't understood. Why does God allow so much suffering in the world? Because the world is full of death, not life. This is an illusion of life. Real life has entered the world in Jesus himself, the author of life. He has come so that you could have life. Because we're in the midst of death. So when we scrape trying to hold on to death, we push away the author of life. But God, I have to pause because I can only imagine how the enemy felt when he discovered what God was doing. He was sure that when Adam and Eve, they would die. But God had sown into the very fabric of creation a fundamental truth. Morning follows night. Life follows death. How is it possible? Oh, I love C.S. Lewis. If only you understood the deep magic. If only you understood that the seed must die. The flower, my wife taught me this truth. The flower must crawl through the dirt in order to bloom. Because life, you see, follows death. The cell must die in order for new life to be created, in order for the baby to become a child, for the child to become fully mature. Life, you see, follows death. And Isaac was already destined to die. But God tested Abraham. I'm not sure it's the test that I thought it was. God tested Abraham. Will he see that the key to the promise of life is not in Isaac, but it is in God himself? Because God provides the lamb. And it's so comforting to be so many years removed and to know that Jesus is the lamb bound for my sin. God himself saves, not out of any work that we could boast. I always like to pause here and say, my boasting is that I'm not as bad as some. I'm better than most. But God does not save based upon my work. He saves based upon his own goodness and faithfulness. God saves out of His grace, His love, His unending faithfulness. And so God speaks again to Abraham. I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Do you see what God swears by? Himself. Nothing else is needed. God alone is sufficient. His promise alone is enough. And so your salvation is offered. Your blessed life is offered. Your hope, your joy, your happiness, your future are promised upon the existence of God alone. I'll have to pause because I want to make sure that we're getting it here. I used to teach this class and I would draw upon the whiteboard the scale like the blind lady holds, justice. The scale to determine if your life is worthy of eternal salvation. And we weigh on one side your good acts and on the other your bad acts. Do you know that this is the heart of every religious faith on the planet, save one? Now here's the quiz, kids. Do you know the one religion? That it is not based upon the weight of your sin versus the weight of your good deeds. Only Christianity. Because do you know what happens? If there is a scale, which there is not, your bad is on one side. And it doesn't matter how much good you put on it, you can't outweigh your sin. And so God does something. He walks up and He puts the thumb of Jesus on the scale. Oh, you're in. Because God Himself has provided the Lamb. And the text tells us something remarkable. Since our salvation is offered upon the existence of God alone, we simply must dare to believe, and in belief, respond, act in obedience. But I want to pause. I love this word, Shema. Obey. Obey. A similar word shows up in the New Testament too. It can be translated obey, yes it can, but it can also be translated, and actually more often translated, hear. Simply hear. Which is why I think our Lord stands and says, he who has ears, let him hear. Where does salvation come from? God alone. Do you hear it? It's why it's so remarkable in this story. Go back and read Abraham, knife, stop. And what does he hear? The lamb in the bushes, caught, trapped. Do you hear what God has done for you? Do you hear? God will speak. The lamb has been offered. Do you hear? Do you believe? Will you respond to the offered lamb? And I love Abraham's reply when God speaks. Stop. Abraham says, here I am. And it's a beautiful phrase. And we're going to offer an invitation. And you get to decide if you have heard. If you have heard God speak, revealing the Lamb, pointing to the sacrifice for your sin, the salvation that you desperately need, an eternity that is promised based upon His glory, not yours. one offered since the beginning, the Lamb. And if you will hear, will you respond? Whatever your need is this morning, I hope that you'll make it known. If we can pray for you and encourage you in any way, we want to do that. If you have never claimed Jesus and understood, heard, and believed that He is in fact the Lamb of God, God Himself in the flesh, the Son of God, who died for your sin, who rose from the dead, who lives forever, that you can be baptized to claim the gift of God, to be born again, raised to life from death. If you need that, please come as we stand together and sing.